Bible. There it started. That's for people that won't be here off and on. So not only is the Bible important book of history, but it's an important book of teachings. It's our authority. It's where the instructions for this life come from. So there's been foundations of civilizations that have been built on the Bible, from Bible times in the Old Testament all the way up to the Roman Empire and different civilizations. And so we're going to look at the geography. We're going to look at some great subjects of Scripture, subjects that have formed what Protestants and Catholics have believed for 2,000 years. And so I'm just kind of setting that up, that we need to keep in mind that in the next few weeks, I'm not trying to interpret the Bible for you. I'm not trying to interpret the Bible for you, but I am trying to give you the tools to interpret the Bible. Because I think it's important that we dig into it. I just want to give you the tools, the knowledge, the understanding. And so that's why I'm giving you handouts every week. That's why there's going to be a test at the end of every class. Not for me, but for you. For you to be able to take that and say, this is what I learned. So let's get started. Let's look at section number 1 of what I want to talk about, and that is the structure of the Bible. There was an engineer, an electrical engineer, his name was Charles Steinmetz. He was hired by an appliance manufacturer because they were having trouble with one particular machine. And he went in, he spent about 5 minutes, placed an X on a machine, they fixed it, and asked for his invoice. His invoice was for $10,000 for about 2 minutes worth of work. And so they said, can you itemize that? Can you tell us why it's so expensive? And what he said was, well, making the mark is $1. Knowing where to make the mark, $9,999. Right? So it's all about knowing where to place the X. It's all about knowing the chalk marks of the Bible, if you will. Knowing those places. And if we're not careful, here's what happens to us. The task becomes real overwhelming. How many people right now would be honest enough to say that either you have said or you know someone who has said, the Old Testament, I don't even read it because I don't understand it. Anybody want to be brave enough to... We've done that. Well, I hope that maybe we can get through this jungle of unpronounceable names and terrible things that somehow we see as God being unjust and awful. And I hope that we can get through that and you'll have a better understanding about that. So here's the key. The key is understanding the structure of the Bible. Understand, if you want to learn architecture, you need to learn how buildings are put together, right? If you want to learn sailing, you need to learn how a boat works. Hello? And if you want to learn the Bible, then you've got to learn how the Bible was put together. And so that's really where we're headed. And I'm taking my time to make sure you understand that, because we're not going to interpret the Bible. We're just going to understand where it came from. So let's get started. The Bible has 2 major divisions. And listen, if you say to me, listen, that's pretty elementary, I'm going to punch you in the throat. All right? We're going to all start at the very beginning and just make our way through this thing together. Two divisions, and we know them as what? The Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament and the New Testament. Here's the storyline of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, it begins with creation. This is in your handout, so you might want to fill this out. It begins with creation and tells the story of the Jewish people up to the time of Christ. The Old Testament is the story that begins with creation and then tells the story of the Jewish people from their beginnings up to the time of Christ. That's what the Old Testament is. That's why it's important for us to understand it. It's made up, most of you know, it's made up of 39 individual books. There are 39 books, 39 divisions, if you will, of the Old Testament, written by 28 different authors, and that happened over a span of 2,000 years. 39 books, 28 authors over the period of 2,000 years. So the Old Testament, again, it begins with creation, tells the story of the Jewish people up till the time of Christ. The New Testament. The New Testament is... it tells the story of the birth of Jesus, his life, his ministry, and the ministry of his disciples, which was carried on after he was resurrected. He was crucified. Let me say that one more time. The New Testament is the record of the birth of Jesus, his life, his ministry, and the ministry of his disciples, which was carried on after Jesus was crucified. That's what the New Testament is all about. If you want to put the New Testament in one statement, say, what is the New Testament about? That's what it's about. All right, it's comprised of 27 books written by 9 authors. And this might seem revelatory to you. It was written over a time period of just 100 years. The New Testament came to us and was written over a time period of just 100 years. So you put all that together, the 39, the 27, we have a total of, how many? I'm sorry? 66. Yeah, 66 books. We want to keep that in mind. And here's the key to understanding those 39 books of the Old Testament. There's 3 divisions. 3 divisions, or 3 kinds, if you will, 3 kinds of books in the Old Testament. There's historical books, there's poetical books, and then there's prophetical books. 3 divisions: history, poetry, prophecy. All right, you with me so far? So here's why that's important. You say, well, why do I need to know that? Because if you know what kind of book you're reading, then you know what kind of information you're going to get from it. If you know you're reading a book of history, then you look for the history in the book. If you know it's poetry, then you're looking for the poetry in the book. You know what to expect. If you want to read those particular issues about the Jewish people up through the time of Christ, this is the historical timeline of the Jewish people. And so, if you want to read the prophecy of the Old Testament, you read those final 17 books. And in some of those cases, you'll get overlap, right? There'll be a little bit of overlap, some poetry and history, and some history and prophecy. But the main theme of the history books are history, even though you may get some poetry and prophecy in there. Now, when you talk about just the history books of the Old Testament, there's 2 divisions there. 11 of them are primary history books. 6 of them are secondary history books. In other words, what I mean by that is that those first 11 are going to tell you the history of the Jewish people, and then the next 6 are going to just repeat that. I don't know if some of you that have read through the Old Testament, you might recognize some things that are happening in 1st and 2nd Kings. You read it again in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And I mean, it's the same stories. But so there's 11 books that are the primary history books, but then there's 6 of them that kind of repeat that history, and that history is advanced in the 11 and then repeated in the 6. And here's the historical timeline of the Old Testament. And before I show you this graphic, let me just say, we know it: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, right? The Bible is not laid out in chronological order. It's not chronological, all right? What I mean by that, it wasn't necessarily that Genesis was the first book that was ever written, and Exodus was number 2. As a matter of fact, you see on this particular graphic that it's not that way. Job was written about the same time as Genesis was written. The Psalm, that came during the time of 2 Samuel. While Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Solomon, they were written at the time of 1 Kings, and so on. And I think I put that graphic in your handout. I think. Maybe I didn't. I don't remember. It's not in there. But you just need to understand that as you go through the Old Testament, it's not laid out chronologically. It's really laid out in a way that makes it, the first 17 books are historical, the next books are poetical, and those last books are prophetical. So you need to just kind of keep that in mind, because as you read a book and you know what kind of book it is, then you know what you can expect information-wise. Reading a history book, it's going to be history. New Testament's kind of laid out the same way. The New Testament has historical books, has Pauline epistles. Pauline epistles. Those are letters that were written by the Apostle Paul. Okay? Pauline epistles. They're letters. That's what an epistle is. It's a letter to a church. And then there are general epistles. Same kind of thing. It's a written letter, but it was written by other people. So you can do your own math there. When you hear people say, well, Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. There it is. Pauline epistles. 13 out of the 27 were Pauline epistles. The first 5 books are history books. Next 13, Pauline epistles. The last 9 are general epistles. So if you want to read the story of Jesus and the birth of the church, what you want to read is the first 5 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Acts of the Apostles. That's the history of Jesus and the church. So when you read those books, that's what you expect. I want to hear the history. How many have just really fallen in love with reading the genealogies of Jesus? I mean, really don't. Yeah, I figured only Matthew and Dale. Yeah, that really doesn't surprise me. I mean, that sounds almost normal.
I got into a debate with my college professor on the New Testament over the genealogy.
Did you win?
Almost. I mean, I was arguing in the Greek.
Right.
And, almost won, but the trouble is there's like two different versions of the Greek.
Right, and I think there's two different genealogies listed too, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what it was.
Makes it kind of tough there. But here's the thing: when you read the genealogies, that's history. That's really reading the history of Jesus and where he came from. And so if you want to read about the instructions to the church, you want to read the Pauline epistles, because that's what they are. They're instructions to the church. Someone would come to me and say, I'm a believer, I've been a Christian for a while, I just want to read about how to live a better life. I would direct them to the Pauline epistles. I wouldn't tell them to start in Matthew. I hope that doesn't disappoint anybody, but I wouldn't. You want to know instruction? Get into 1 Corinthians and Romans and 2 Corinthians. Get into some of those letters that Paul wrote to churches to tell them how to live right. And if you want just general instruction, of course, then you get to the other general epistles written by Peter, John, and some of the other apostles. Everybody with me so far? Say uh-huh. Yeah. So you have two divisions, Old Testament, New Testament. You have three divisions within each of those divisions, right? Historical, poetical, prophetical in the Old Testament. And then you have historical, Pauline epistles, and general epistles. And the word epistle just means letter of instruction in the New Testament. The Old Testament is the story of creation and the Jewish people up through the time of Christ. The New Testament is the story of the birth of Jesus, the birth of the church, and the Acts of the Apostles up through about 100 AD, because it was only written in that first 100 years. So if we understand that, if you've got that, I'm just laying the groundwork for what's coming up, then I think what we need to do now is look at the geography of the Bible, because I think it's important.
Wait a second, you skipped.
Like the whole section.
I missed the whole section.
The general content of all epistles are blank on Christian
The
life.
general instructions to churches and individuals.
It just says on Christian.
Well, let me look at my handout that's already filled out. Wait a minute, you handed it out. You gave it to somebody. You gave out my answers. I highlighted in my iPad all the answers I needed to give you, but
I guess not.
the general content of all epistles are instructions on Christian doctrine and living. It's right there on my notes too, and I just didn't even read it. General content of all the epistles are instructions on Christian doctrine and lifestyle. Again, you say, well, why do I even need to know that? Because if someone comes to you and says, how do I know how to live a better life? Don't tell them to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You need to tell them to read Romans or 1 Corinthians or Colossians. That's where you need to direct them to. Don't direct them to history books. Direct them to instruction booklets. Everybody with me? Say uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
At least you know they're paying attention.
Any other questions? Well, that's why I give them handouts, and you make it feel like a meat locker in here. So they pay attention. Deb.
I agree with you about sending them to the epistles, but how come as a new Christian everybody said read John, the Gospel of John? Was it just because it says salvation?
I think, this is my opinion only. Let me emphasize my opinion only. I think, and knowing your background as being in Pentecost, John is really where the Spirit is introduced. Right? You don't hear much about the Spirit in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but you start hearing. Matter of fact, I'll go as far as telling you this. I don't want to confuse anybody, but John, the Gospel of John, almost didn't make it into the Bible, and it was because of that. Because of all of a sudden there was this introduction of this thing called the Spirit, and there was a group of followers of Jesus back in Jesus' time called the Essenes, and the Essenes were all about spiritual things, and so there was debate on whether John should even make it in. because it was an introduction of the Spirit. So I think the reason you hear that in the Pentecostal circle is that's the introduction of the Spirit of God. And again, listen, if someone asks you, where should I start reading, and you feel like you want to tell them to read, start in John, tell them start in John. I'm just telling you, the instructions for life and doctrine for the church are found in the epistles, Pauline and general epistles. The history of Jesus and the birth of the church, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts of the Apostles. That's where it's at. And so, amen. Hallelujah. Tyler.
Do you think if they could do it all over again, they would have put the Bible in a different order?
Well, let's get this out of the way. And I do want to be mindful of the time, because having these two classes together is a challenge, because when the adult class is together, we release the adults because they got to get their kids. You know, the journey room didn't have to worry about that. So I want to be mindful, and if we get bogged down, that's going to be a problem for me. A lot of people have asked the question, you know, how do we even know that we got the books of the Bible that we're supposed to get? Because, you know, the Catholic Church has the book of the Apocrypha, those books in between the end of the Old Testament, beginning of the New Testament. You know, the church fathers around 300 AD, they got together and they had a criteria. They said, is it used in service every week? Can we confirm the author? Can we know the date? You know, a range of date. And so they had like 5 criteria that they used to say, yeah, that book's in. Someone say, well, that's man. Man got involved and decided what we were going to have. If your faith is no more stronger than that, than to believe that man was in charge of it, when I think God decided what we were going to have and work through man like He has since creation to get it to us. And you know, there are Bibles out there that does lay it out chronologically. You can buy them and have the books laid out chronologically. I think more important for me is structure. 17 in Old Testament, 17 history books. You got those poetical books, and then you've got the prophetical books. That's more important to me than necessarily chronology. And when I say chronology, I'm just talking about like linear timeline from 9 o'clock to noon, the chronology of it all. It's really more about the history, it's about the poetry, and it's about the prophecy. And then in the New Testament, history of the church, birth of Jesus, Pauline, and general epistles. Holly.
Not only chronologically, but there are several books that were left out in general. So it wasn't just that God inspired chronological, order or what of the Bible, but also what was supposed to go in it to begin with.
Sure. And again, the revelation of Jesus Christ almost didn't make it. Again, read it. You can figure it out for yourself why it almost didn't make it. It's a weird book, But they were able to match it up to this criteria that said, boom, 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 yes, it's in. I would rather view it that God said, yes, it's in. And then He worked through men to make sure we got it. And I always hesitate even saying these kinds of things because I don't want to encourage anybody to even go read these books. But there is other gospels out there. There's the Gospel of Judas. There's the infant Gospel of Jesus. They're out there. I have read most of them, if not all of them. And once you read them, you understand why they're not in the canon. The canon is what we call the Bible. For instance, and some of you have heard me say this before, the infant Gospel of Jesus has a story about Jesus at 8 years old playing with his friends. And Jesus had built a dam that caused the water to begin to back up, and one of his friends came and kicked the dam down to where the water came through, and Jesus killed him. The parents got mad, so Jesus raised him back to life. I'm not sure. Could that have happened? It could have happened. Is it important for us to know that happened so that we have instructions for our life? No. We read about Lazarus. We read about him being in the tomb. So there's other Gospels out there. There's other books of the Apocrypha. Like I said, they're in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I think we have what God wanted us to have. And I think we got it through means that He created. Men and ladies that decided this is what God wants us to have. And so I think what happens is if we enter into that realm of confusion when we start reading some of this other stuff that's out there, some of the other Gospels that's out there, some of the other books that's out there. It's confusing. And the author of confusion is not God. The author of confusion is the enemy. And it's amazing how many times, if we're not careful, we can be so distracted and not keep the main thing, because that is what we have to do. You know, the questions, I appreciate it. I did have a note saying, let's make it interactive. Let's make sure we answer questions as we go along. So if there's another one, I'm ready. If not, we're going to look at some geography real quick. What is it?
Oh, she asked me, I said I did, but you've gone way past it. I was always told that the book of John was written to the Gentiles. And that's why it was always recommended for new believers or people that you were trying to witness to read that, because it was written to us, not to the Jews.
Well, I mean, I've heard that. I don't know that I agree with that, but I have heard that. You know, Simon Peter was the first guy to take the gospel, the good news, to the Gentiles. But really, Paul was the one who did that. Paul was the one that really started those missionary journeys that started planting however many churches he planted, 12, 13 churches, Ephesus, Corinth, you know, Macedonia, all these different churches that he planted. But, you know, that again, if someone comes to you and says, hey, where should I start reading the Bible? If you want to say to them, start reading Matthew, start at the beginning, start Genesis. I wouldn't recommend you tell them to start reading Genesis. As a new believer, that's probably just going to be a little too confusing. Don't tell them to start in the book of Revelation. Well, you know, if you're a new believer, Jesus is coming soon, you better read the revelation of Jesus Christ. And then they're going to come back to you, what about all these horns and bowls and vials? I don't understand. You know? So you just have to be careful. But I've always told a new believer, Romans. Romans is where to start. And then get into 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because that's really where the instructions you know, for Christian living and doctrine for the church is really founded in those 2 books. 3 books, if you want to say 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Good question, though. Or good comment. What wasn't a question, was it? Anybody else? Anybody? Yes.
You know, when you said Jesus killed the little boy and bread, was that in one of the books?
That was in the infant gospel of Jesus.
Would that be a sin?
Would it be sin?
Would it be a sin if he killed that little boy? He didn't sin.
Well, that really takes us in, you're right. It takes us into a whole different discussion about what is sin, what looks like sin to us, right? Like all those ugly things that God did in the Old Testament, right? There was some ugly stuff in there. There was some murdering going on, who am I? I'm pointing to me. Who am I to decide what a just and righteous God does for me to say, well, that was wrong. He shouldn't have done that. And so I think it takes us to that discussion, but I agree that he was sinless. So if that ever happened, which again, I don't know that it happened, it's just what that particular gospel said. If that happened, then there must be an explanation of how it was not a sin to do that. You know, what I mean, we could take that, and I know we don't want to go there right now. We could take that discussion to Lazarus, right? Mary and Martha sends a message, hey, our brother's sick, you need to hurry. And Jesus delayed 2 days on purpose. Right? He delayed 2 days on purpose, and Lazarus died. Was that? You see what I'm saying? I mean that, but it wasn't a sin. That was Lazarus died so that God could be glorified. And if that little boy, you know, was heart stopped beating, then it was to glorify God. I'll say, even though I'm not even sure that really happened. Daniel.
It could be argued that we know that Jesus' family was devout Jews. And
Yes,
It
absolutely.
was a Jewish law that for murder that someone would be stoned for, be it if it's a minor, then his parent, or the offender himself. So I would argue whether or not that it had occurred that actually happened that the child killed another child.
I mean, I don't believe the authenticity of the infant gospel of Jesus. I don't believe the authenticity of the gospel of Judas. So, you know, we have the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but supposedly Judas has one too. But I don't believe the authenticity of it. I think that was something that was injected into culture and society later to try to make Judas look like a good guy. But, you know, the truth is, he betrayed the Savior. And so, I mean, those are really some good discussions. And if you really want to get into that kind of stuff, there's guys that are a whole lot smarter than me to talk about that. Ravi Zacharias, just YouTube his name. And just about any really difficult question you got, he's got a YouTube video on there for it. Dr. Paul Bond, there's a bunch of them that we could talk about, but we're going to move on. Is that all right? because I really that's above my pay grade. I think understanding the size and locations of things and the relationship and the distances between places gives us perspective. You know, sometimes we hear Canaan or Palestine and Eden and Egypt, and sometimes we don't really have that picture in our mind. I think a knowledge of those things gives us the perspective. And so I just want to spend the last little bit of this class time talking about some geography and the primary anchors. Listen to me carefully. Primary anchors of the Old Testament are bodies of water. Bodies of water. The primary anchors of the Old Testament geography, bodies of water. On your little map there, I think if it's a letter, it's a body of water. And then in a minute we're going to have, if it's a number, it's body of waters. A letter, it's going to be a place. Bless you. So, somebody tell me what number 1 is there? Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean Sea. It's a huge anchor in Old Testament geography. The land of the Old Testament lies east of the Mediterranean Sea. Number 2? Sea of Galilee. To call it a sea is really an overstatement. It's really only about 7 miles wide and 14 miles long. It lies inland of the Mediterranean about 36 miles. So from the edge of the Mediterranean to the Sea of Galilee, from number 1 to number 2, it's about 36 miles. That's important to kind of get your mind wrapped around that. Only 36 miles. Okay? Number 3, Jordan River. Flows south out of the Sea of Galilee and it empties into the Dead Sea. And there is a bunch of history around that little river. A bunch of history around one little bitty river. That's why it's important for you to kind of get that as an anchor point. If you're going to try to understand the Bible, understand where the Jordan River's at. Number 4, Dead Sea. What's the cool thing about the Dead Sea?
It's dead.
It's dead. No. Lowest point on earth. It's the lowest point on earth. It's the Dead Sea. There's nothing living in that water because it has no outlet. It has input but no output. And so you get all the minerals, all the chemicals, everything that's in there, it flows in but not out. And the result of that is this high level of mineral deposits that will not support normal plant or animal life. So there's nothing living there. It's dead. I mean, you may have seen pictures, people like just floating in it without an inner tube because the water is so dense with these minerals and these different deposits because there's nowhere for it to go. It's Dead Sea, 3,000 feet below sea level. Number 5?
Nile.
The Nile. Tell me one really cool fact about the Nile River.
The Nile's not just a river.
The Nile's not just a river, it's a place in Egypt. Right. It's one of 3 rivers in the world, I think, that flows south to north. Most of them flow north to south. But this one flows north and empties into the Mediterranean Sea.
Big Sandy does too.
So, yeah, I knew there was another one around here somewhere, which is really kind of a cool thing. Number 6 and number 7, anybody?
Tigris and Euphrates.
Tigris is number 6. Euphrates is number 7. I'm supposed to be hitting these so that you can look how cool my little PowerPoint is. It actually comes up with these on there. Look at that. And I haven't even been hitting them. What's wrong with me? So let's get up to number 7. Number 6 is the Tigris. Everybody knows how to spell that, but they want to know how to spell Euphrates. Right? E-U-P-H-R-A-T-E-S. Euphrates.
I was more concerned about the training.
And you'll understand why those 2 rivers are important. They flow about 1,000 miles, and as you see, they empty into number 8, which is Persian Gulf. Persian Gulf. All right, so these are the anchors of the Old Testament, bodies of water. Sea of Galilee, Mediterranean Sea, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Nile River, Tigris and Euphrates River, and the Persian Gulf. Important places. Questions about those bodies of water? Anybody? Because I want to show you some geography real quick before we end, and before you take a test. All right, now let's talk about some locations of the Old Testament. Locations of the Old Testament. Letter A there. Anybody want to guess? Garden of Eden. And again, we think that's where it was at. Nobody can really say for sure. It does talk about it being at the head of 4 rivers, 2 of which are mentioned, Tigris and Euphrates. So we think that's about where the Garden of Eden was at. Of course, that's where creation began. B actually has 3 answers to it. B has 3 answers. One of them is Canaan. Canaan. The second one is Israel. The third one is Palestine. So it actually has 3 names. It's a small piece of real estate that lies between the Mediterranean and the 3 bodies of water known as the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. How many miles from the Mediterranean to the Sea of Galilee? 36. 36 miles is all it is. Not even from here to Charleston. Think about that. The nation of Israel in that small place. In Genesis, it's called Canaan. After the Hebrew people established themselves in the land, in the book of Joshua, it becomes known as Israel. But then 800 years later, at the beginning of the New Testament, it's called Palestine. So that's why we have all 3 of those names there. We have Canaan, we have Israel, we have Palestine. And it's why there is still such kind of uproar in that region over Israel versus Palestine. You've heard that uproar, right? That conflict. We'll talk about that later. Letter C, anybody? Jerusalem. Jerusalem's an important part of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Letter D? Egypt, where the Nile River empties into the Mediterranean, northern part of Africa. What about letter E up there at the top of the map?
That's it.
What was it?
I didn't say anything.
Assyria. You say, why is Assyria important? If you read the history of the Jewish people, you find out that when they became a divided kingdom, the northern kingdom of 10 tribes, southern kingdom of 2 tribes, it was Assyria that captured the northern kingdom and took those people away. Also, Assyria, when they were taken captive and God said for them not to intermingle or intermarry with the people of Assyria, they did anyway, and we got Samaritans. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear me say Samaritans?
That good one.
There was a good one. There was a good Samaritan, and the woman at the well was Samaritan. That's why nobody would talk to her, because I'm not being ugly, but they considered Samaritans half-breeds. They weren't real Jewish people, even though they were. All right, letter F. Babylon. And we know if you read the history of the Jewish people, you find out the northern kingdom taken captivity by the Assyrians. Southern kingdom was taken captive by the Babylonians. So that's why it's important. And for a short period of time, it was the Babylonians that conquered the Assyrians. For a short period of time. They weren't in charge for very long, but they were a gigantic power, even though it was short-lived, conquering Assyria. And they're found in the Bible. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as Mesopotamia. Not really important for you to get that, except for to know that word really means Meso, in the middle of, Potamia, rivers. So it's in the middle of rivers. Babylon in the middle of rivers. And you can see that on the map. Michael.
Did the people of those 2 tribes intermingle with Babylonians?
It was only a 70-year exile, if you will. And I'm sure they did, but we don't really read that. Not that I know of. We don't read about that in the Old Testament history, but I'm sure they did. What's worse than that is that in 70 years, the people of Israel forgot about who God was. When they go back to Jerusalem, they begin to write things down. It's then that they really begin to write things down. Before that, it was oral history. It was me just telling you, let me tell you what happened with Moses. Let me tell you what happened with Noah and the flood. But then after they were in captivity, they began to write some things down. And so I think what's worse is that, and I can't remember the chapter and verse and book, but the people of Israel are instructed to train their children in the ways of God because they've forgotten in 70 years. I think that's worse than anything. Is forgetting who God is. And so you have Babylon that conquered Assyria, short-lived but very powerful. And then Babylon was conquered by who? Persia. That's the letter G. King Xerxes, right? That was 300. Everybody remember? I'm sorry. Xerxes. I'm sorry, Mr. Great Teacher. Xerxes. So the Persia comes into play by conquering Babylonia. And it allows, it was Persia, when you read the history of the Jewish people, it was Persia that let them return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to rebuild their city. And so that's why it's so important, because they were able then to reinstate their worship and reintroduce their people to God. So here's my suggestion to you, is keep these handouts and just study the geography of the Old Testament. Some of you may think geography, man, I'm past that. I don't want to stay. If we understand when God says that the people went from Babylon back to Jerusalem, and we have that picture in our mind, then we kind of know what that's all about, right? And so if you want to take a quick look at the geography compared to today, again, you got the Mediterranean Sea on the left-hand side, Persian Gulf on the right-hand side. That's today's world of those particular locations. Iran is really in that place of Assyria, right? Iraq, close to where Persia was. Israel is Israel. Saudi Arabia is that wilderness experience. And that's kind of where everything's at. Egypt is still Egypt. Some of them stayed the same. And I want to show you one more graphic, and then I want to pass out this little self-test. You can cheat if you want to. I prefer you close your handouts and take this little test. It's not that hard, but just to see what you retain. I want you to see how small of an area this whole area really is. And so to do that, we just take the state of Texas and we place it over that map. I've got to get some new batteries or something. I don't know what's going on. Oh boy, here we go. Here we go with this slow one at a time. Yeah, okay, Terry, you're really good with your PowerPoint. Look at all that cool stuff. Eden. Here, yeah. Oh boy. So really, you can take the history of the Old Testament and put it in the state of Texas.
El Paso's underwater.
Think about that. Think about that. Think about the creation of the world, Abraham, Noah, all these great names that we know and all these great things that happened in the Old Testament, and really, you can put that into the size of the state of Texas, and that's where it happened. That's where it all began, in those first thousands of years. And I just think that's just kind of a cool factoid. So, any questions about that? Because I'm ready to give you your test, and then we'll pray and be dismissed. And I am amazed that I was done at 5 after 8. That's crazy. Anything? Anybody?
It's not even 8 yet, that's fast.
Is that fast?
Yeah.
Wow.
7:59.
Look at me.
You're fast.
A couple guys.
The quick sir.
What about Cyprus, man?
Next week we're going to really break down the historical books, and then we're going to start talking about eras: the creation era, the patriarchal era, conquest, judges. We're going to get into the eras. This week I really just wanted to give you that basic understanding of the geography and the breakdown structure of the Old Testament, New Testament. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes after I see that everybody has I asked him to recruit people, but he's just so selfish. What is wrong with him?
Did you guys pass them out?
I'll pass it down.
I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll go through the answers.
I don't know this.
I object to the second question on this test.
Second question?
Yeah.
How many books in the New Testament?
No! Okay, the second section of the question.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry.
All right. I love the buzz. I love hearing the buzz. That means people are talking. That's good.
They all get 0.
What happens if I fail?
You can't come
I need
back.
something to write.
Thank you, buddy. Everybody have a test? Don't you put that down. I just love being a teacher. Where's my ruler at?
Yeah, I think I'm very upset.
She's very upset.
He didn't tell me I had to learn something else. He just told me how to
While you're waiting. I've always been told that John was written more as a story and it was easier to read. That's what I have always
And I believe that could be true as well. You know, whether it was written to the Gentiles, whether it was easier to read just because it was a story. I mean, both those could be true. But if you do go back and read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's John where you start hearing about the Spirit of God, Spirit of God, Spirit of God, and that was kind of the high mark. Of course, there's debate about what they call the Q Gospel. The Q Gospel was supposedly something that was written that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John stole all their information from. It's actually called Quail, but they called it Q Gospel. Again, I just believe by faith that we have what we're supposed to have, known as the Bible, the Holy Bible, the canon.
Is it bad to read those others?
Pardon?
Is it bad to read?
I don't think it's bad. But you need to read it.
Line it up with.
I think. Well, no, I wouldn't even line it up. I just read it guarded, very guarded. All right.
We don't even done.
Yeah.
I'm waiting. I just said all right.
That means you're ready to move on.
Class.
Pressuring us.
Class. I just went back to my old Cheech and Chong days just then. Woo, class. Yeah, let's get it.
He did. Pizza and history.
All right. Let's just go through that. If you're not done, you grade your own paper, and you can fill in the blanks that you don't have. But we need to get finished up. All right. So here we go. The Bible. How many books in the Old Testament?
39.
And how many in the New Testament?
27.
And how many total?
66.
Good. The Old Testament is the story of and the people, their poets and their prophets. 3 kinds of books in the Old Testament. They are
Historical, poetic, prophetic.
yeah. Somebody said prophecy. Somebody said prophetical. As long as you got this prophecy there at the end. History, poetry, prophecy. How many history books? 17. How many of the poetry books? And how many? Thank you. Hey, you guys just want to get out of here, don't you? New Testament. New Testament is the story of the church. Well, that would be right. I couldn't mark that wrong. Jesus the Christ. That's true. I couldn't mark that wrong. The church that he founded and its growth under the leadership of his apostles after his death. 3 kinds of books in the New Testament. History, Pauline, general. How many books of history? 5. How many books of the Pauline? And how many general? 9. Man, either I'm a really good teacher or you guys already knew all this stuff. Or you cheated. Yeah, or you cheated. I didn't want to say that, but... Okay, let's look at the geography. Again, letters are locations, numbers are bodies of water. So number 1 was correct. Number 2, correct. Number 3. Okay, stop. Look, here it is. Stop. Just stop. Number 1, Mediterranean Sea. Number 4, or what is?
Stop.
I guess it is a little confusing, isn't it?
Say
Look,
number 1.
it's right on mine.
Number 1 is correct all the time.
If it's a letter, it's a body of water. If it's a number, it's body of water. Letter, it's a location. Right? So number 1 is the Mediterranean Sea. Number 2 is the Sea of Galilee. Number 3 is the Jordan River. Number 4 is the Dead Sea. Number 5 was the Nile River. Number 6, the Tigris. 7, Euphrates. And 8 was the Persian Gulf. That's all the numbers. Okay, that's all the numbers.
You want this back?
You want it again? Okay, number 1, Mediterranean Sea. Number 2, not the second blank, but number 2 is the Sea of Galilee. Number 3 is the Jordan River. Number 4 is the Dead Sea. Number 5 is the Nile River. Number 6 is the Tigris. Number 7 is the Euphrates. And number 8 is the Persian Gulf. Everybody got the bodies of water.
I got a 100.
Well, wait a minute. We haven't done locations yet.
the mad and the dead. The red.
The red, I think that's over near China somewhere.
Oh, it is.
I think it is. Here's the locations. These are your letters, okay? Here's your letters. A is the Garden of Eden, where we think it was. A is the Garden of Eden. B is Israel, Canaan, or Palestine. I'll accept either of those answers. Israel.
One of them on there.
Pardon?
Israel was the only one that was on this.
Yeah, it was.
If you go back and look at our other map,
I know it was Canaan and all
right,
that, but
but
Israel was the only one
there's only one on your list to choose from of your multiple choices. I understand. Letter C is Jerusalem. I am going to bring in my ruler next week. Jerusalem is letter C. Letter D is Egypt. Right? Everybody with me so far? D is Egypt. E is Assyria. Assyria. F is Babylonia. And G is Persia.
Yeah.
I know. To be honest with you, this was a series I taught 20 years ago. And I haven't taught it since then. And so I still had my files, but they were exact files rather than Word files. And so I drag them down on the Word and I open them up. But then it's got all those things in there. I tried to catch them, but it just didn't work on some of them. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right. Geography, bodies of water, location, structure of the New Testament, Old Testament. I think those are good starting points for us. But we really need to get into some of the eras, creation era, patriarch era. We'll even get into 8 of the great teachings of the Bible. Again, not to interpret them, but just to tell you what they are and then you interpret them.
You want these back?
No, you keep all of that. If I find any of that in any chair, I'm going to match your handwriting to you are, and I'm going to hunt you down.
And punch us in the throat. That's not right.
Joanna. There wasn't? That's a good problem, isn't it?
But
See-
there's like a bunch right there.
There are some. Yeah, there are some right here. Here's some extra pamphlets if anybody needs them. Take care of that for me. There's a couple of these back there. Yeah, okay. Welcome. We're going to open with prayer, and then the praise team's going to worship us a little bit.
Worship us.
I was about to say worship a little bit.